right, so today we're starting up a new section of notes. So new section, so we're going to write down Japan isolation, and then we're going to underline Japan isolation. So we're going to write down Japan isolation and underline. So we're talking about Japan from the time period when we have the Tokugawas. So this is Tokugawa right here. To the time period in which we have the Tokugawas get out of power and Emperor Meiji takes over. So we're talking about from the time period that Tokugawa was in charge to the time period in which Meiji is in charge. Once again, we're right now Japan isolation, and we're going to underline our section title. So new sections. We're going to underline our section title. All right. So this stuff we already kind of talked about. We already talked about the samurai before. You can kind of see in there some more pictures here of samurai. So you can kind of see some more pictures of them here. And you can see some more equipment that we haven't seen before. So you can see their blades here. But you can also see a bow, for example. And you see how tall that bow is. And you also see this guy with a spear. So kind of other weapons that we haven't really talked about before. And you can see here a samurai on a horseback using the bow. So samurais would use bows off the horsebacks, and they also kind of use their blades off the horsebacks as well. Go ahead and make a bullet and write down life in Japan under the Tokugawa. So bullet, life in Japan under Tokugawa. So life in Japan under Tokugawa was for 250 years. So from the year 1600, and when Tokugawa wins at the Battle of Sekigahara, to 250 years after that, into the 1850s. The Tokugawas are in charge. And for 250 years, Japan is pretty stable and there is prosperity. Go ahead and make a 1, and we're going to write down 2.5 centuries of stability and prosperity. So 2.5 centuries of stability and prosperity. Now, even though there is stability and prosperity when the Tokugawas are in charge of 250 years, the Tokugawas don't also interact with anybody else in the world for 250 years. You know, for 250 years, they let the Chinese trade with them, and they let the Dutch trade at Nagasaki. And that's about it. They don't really contact anybody else and really talk to anybody else. They're pretty much just doing their own thing, and they're not looking out as to what the rest of the world is doing. Now, you might not know what a century is, so I probably should explain what a century is. So a century is 100 years. Okay, so if I say a century, that simply just means that it's 100 years. All right. So we're going to make a 2, and we're going to write down century, and then equal sign 100 years. Okay. So 2 is century equal sign 100 years. So a century is 100 years. And how centuries work is that the very first century is actually from the year 1 to the year 0, I guess, but year 1. Year 1 to year 99 is the first century. The second century is then the second set of 100 years. So from 100 to 199. Okay, so that would then be the second century. So right now the year is 2020. So we're actually in the 21st century, because it's the 21st 100 years. Okay, so that's how that kind of works. So a good way of figuring out what century you're in, simply take the last 2 numbers of the year, forget about them, just erase them, and then add 1 to the first 2 numbers. So for example, if I was in the year 1844, I take off the last 2 numbers, the 44, that leaves me to 18. I add 1 to 18, 19th century. Okay, so that's how that kind of works. This right here we already kind of talked about before. So we already kind of talked about the society structure before in our pyramid. So we had talked about this before. There's a couple new things that were kind of added to our culture. So we had various plays, dramas that were kind of added in this time period. Haikus also came around this time period. We're going to make a 3. We're going to write down haiku, a 3-line verse of poetry. So haiku is a 3-line verse of poetry. It is 5 syllables, then 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. What's a syllable? So for example, taking the word haiku. So it's high-ku. So you kind of notice how there's like two parts to it, hai and then ku. So I say those two parts in, one breath for each part. So it's made of two syllables. All right. So hai, ku, two syllables. So it's 5 syllables and 7 syllables, then 5. Now this over here at the bottom picture, that's for kabuki. A kabuki is where all the actors wear this elaborate makeup and costumes. All right, so that's a kabuki. So that's kind of just a picture for the kabuki. Make a 4, and we're gonna write down kabuki. And then we're gonna make equal sign. So kabuki, equal sign. And then we're gonna write down actors wore elaborate costumes and makeup. So kabuki, equal sign, actors wore elaborate costumes and makeup. And that picture in the bottom left-hand corner is kind of an example of that, of people wearing the very elaborate costumes and makeup. Okay. This right here is just a picture of a early interaction between the Japanese and the Europeans. So this right here, that's supposed to be a European guy, and then that's supposed to be a servant. Then you have someone walking a dog. I realize the dog looks like a goat, but there you go. I suppose it's probably actually supposed to be a slave in all fairness. So it's supposed to be a European with a slave and a dude with a dog that looks like a goat. So this is kind of just an early on picture of what the Japanese impression was of the Europeans. So that's kind of how they drew them, as you can see there in the picture. And in the early days, when the Europeans first came, they did trade with the Japanese, but after the year 1600, when the Tokugawas win, that's when the Tokugawas are like, no. And they kind of just boot them out. And the Tokugawas, they didn't just boot out, people for like trading with them. They didn't like Christianity really either. So the Tokugawas also kick out Christianity, and they banned the practice of Christianity in Japan. All right, so Christians did start coming to the area in the mid 1500s. Fire guns came to Japan mid 1500s, but the Tokugawas didn't like that. So bam, Christianity guns, they kind of get banned. Well, guns don't get banned, but guns coming from Europe get banned, and then Christianity gets banned as well. We're going to make a 5, and we're going to write down closed country policy. Closed country policy. So the Japanese had a closed country policy, which basically meant they didn't trade with anybody unless it was the Chinese or the Dutch at one port of Nagasaki. That was it. That's the only place that foreigners could trade at. So 5 is closed country policy. All right, we're going to stop there for today.